Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the 11th Annual Naval Aviation Symposium. First, I'd like to thank the New Orleans bands who you've been listening to for the last half hour, and Senior Chief Beveridge. A round of applause for that excellent band from New Orleans. I'm sure that band has all got us in the mood. It's been my privilege for the past 3 years as President and CEO of the Naval Aviation Museum Foundation to kick off our annual symposium. Those of you that have been here in the past have heard this quote before. There are old aviators and bold aviators, but there are no old, bold aviators. At that juncture, remember, I would introduce a gentleman, first year at 97 years old, disproved that quotation. Next year, 98 years old. Next year, 99 years old. Ladies and gentlemen, Art Ziegler, 100 years old. Will you stand up, please, Art? Last year, not to surprise Art, he was sitting in about the same spot, and before I came up here, I went up to Art and I said, you know, I'm going to say a few words about you and I'll ask you to stand up at the appropriate moment. He said, you want me to jump up in the chair? There's been a lot of changes in this museum since last May, those that were there at that time, with our QB Bar Cafe and our simulator and our IMAX theater and our film, The Magic of Flight. A lot of exciting things have happened. It has really driven visitors to our museum beyond our wildest expectations. In fact, we're about 74% of visitation this year as opposed to last year. And that's as it should be, because our mission is to put forth the proud heritage and importance of naval aviation. And the more people we touch, the better we're doing our job. Captain Bob Rasmussen, the director of the museum, naval officer, former Blue Angel artist, and is responsible, he and his staff, for a lot of the exhibits that you see in the way we're done and the cleanliness and how this museum works on the Navy side. 300 volunteers support this museum. They really set the chemistry of what this museum is all about, and the courtesies extended. They'll wear their blue coats, and they'll do aircraft restoration, and they'll do information desk, and they'll do tours. But I want to give a round of applause to these volunteers who do an excellent job here. The senior officer present in Pensacola is Vice Admiral Pat Tracy. She took over CNET in July 1996. Really, she has two hats. She's Director of Naval Training, which is an office and a staff in Washington, and the Chief of Naval Education and Training here in Pensacola. As a result of that, if it was legitimate for her to get frequent flyer mileages, I think she'd be all set. She spends about 60% of her time in Washington dealing with those problems and the rest down here. But it's a privilege to have her here today, and I would like to invite her to the podium to welcome you to her area.
Thank you, Admiral. Admiral Wiesner, Admiral Edney, Admiral Bennett, fellow flag officers, all of the naval aviation heroes who are in this room today, both the old, the bold ones and the not so old but bold ones. Welcome to Pensacola. All of us in the Naval Education and Training Command are delighted to be able to welcome you back to the cradle of naval aviation and to this magnificent museum. It's events like this that make this a very, very special kind of a museum. It brings together not just the historical artifacts of naval aviation, but it brings together in this kind of forum the intellects, the spirits, and the voices of the men and women who made naval aviation history what it is and continue to make naval aviation history for the future. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to welcome you here to Pensacola. I look forward to participating in some, at least, of the symposium. And I can't tell you how awesome it is just to stand on the platform with these gentlemen over here to my right. Welcome. Thank you.
It is my pleasure now to get on with the program and introduce our moderator, Mr. Roy Neal. In 1993, he was moderator for a panel that we called at that time Navy to the Moon, the Apollo program. It was the same group absent one member. Wally Schirra fell off a horse and broke his collarbone. So he was not here at the time, and I'm sure Wally will comment on that fall at some point during the time. If not, ask him the question from the audience. Roy Neal served as NBC news correspondent from 1952 until 1986. Recognized as one of the leading news experts of aerospace, he covered the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo flights and was instrumental in setting up NBC's coverage plans for the space shuttle flights. He is currently chairman of the Shuttle Amateur Radio experiment that provides radio communications for astronauts and cosmonauts to talk with children in schools around the world. If there is anything this museum does to the older type guys that have a lot of nostalgia, and that's very important, but right now we're really focusing on youth and driving what our game, naval aviation, is all about, and driving values and motivation into these young children. So with that, Roy, thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for coming back, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Jack. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Gee, what a pleasure it is to be back here in this beautiful auditorium with the most expensive quarterdeck I've ever seen in my life lurking in the background. I'm excited right now because this afternoon I hope that all of us will share what could be an extraordinary experience, because we are at the turn right now of another century, and 100 years from now, it's nice to think that the stories you're about to hear will still be heard and read on the lips and in the books of our grandchildren's children, and so will the names of these gentlemen to my right, of the first man to walk on the moon, Neil Armstrong. And how extraordinary it is that we also have the last man to walk on the moon, Captain Eugene Cernan. To say nothing of the fact that we have here the only man ever to play golf on another planet, Admiral Alan Shepard. And oh yes, there's the man who went to the moon not once, but twice, and never landed, Captain Jim Lovell. And that famous horseback rider, the only man ever to fly in Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, Captain Wally Schirra. You know what's neat about this gang? They all share some common bonds. First off, all were naval aviators, which in itself is worthwhile, don't you think? Second, these men are all fine test pilots. All are part of the moon mission, which will be the subject this afternoon of our hangar flying. And I think that's what we could really call this, a little hangar flying. I guess you might call the beginning of our modern space age the traditional starting point, the launch of something called Sputnik. It was the 4th of October, 1957. Good Lord, fellows, that was 40 years ago. hate to think of it. Sputnik led to immediate and disturbed reaction here in the United States, you might remember. And where were we was the question being asked, and the answer was nowhere in that arena. We had practically nothing. A position made even more embarrassing when those darn Russians put up Sputnik 2 into orbit with a dog named Laika. And I wonder how many in this room remember that that was the second space flight. President Eisenhower immediately called on the United States Naval Research Laboratory. He wanted an instant miracle. He wanted a United States satellite put into orbit. But you can't build a modern rocket overnight. Launched prematurely, the Vanguard rocket blew up, and it remained for Werner von Braun, a transplanted German scientist and his German team, to put Explorer 1 into orbit, 31st of January, 1958. In October of that year, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration was born, NASA, to go forward into space for peaceful purposes. And NASA, in turn, established the Space Task Group at Langley Research Center to put a man into space. A man, imagine that. A program would be called Mercury, for the fleet messenger of the ancient Roman gods. You remember the one with the wings on his heels? In April of the following year, 1959, 7 young men, top test pilots, were named to be the first astronauts. And 2 of them are here right now. And believe it or not, they look only slightly the worse for wear. Alan Shepard and Wally Schirra. Both were lieutenant commanders in that early era. In 1961, the Russians continued their lead in the space race. They put Major Yuri Gagarin into orbit in April. Behind the scenes, this triggered real reaction by the then President, John F. Kennedy. We're told that he summoned up Lyndon Johnson, Vice President, NASA Administrator James Webb, and Science Advisor Jerome Wiesner to the Oval Office, and he said, what do we do to catch up? They kicked around a plan. Among the plans that were discussed, one to send men to the moon. And in May of 1961, Alan Shepard, boosted by an adapted missile, the Redstone from von Braun's arsenal, became the first American in space. Short flight, 116 miles up and 303 miles downrange, if I'm remembering correctly, Alan. But it was a beginning, and 20 days after that flight, President Kennedy went before Congress to deliver the speech in which he declared, I believe this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. The moon program would be called Apollo, for the Greek archer god, the god of light and truth, bright and shining, far shooting. In August of that year, the Russians orbited Hermann Titov, who remained up there a full day. It wasn't until February '62 that the United States finally was able to put John Glenn into orbit, followed in quick succession by Scott Carpenter and Wally Schirra. Wally flew a 6-orbit mission flawlessly in October of '62, and watching that flight were 9 test pilots, the cadre of the second group of astronauts enlisted by NASA. Again, some of these astronauts who are here with us today. We will share the reminiscences of Neil Armstrong and Jim Lovell. But they flew in Gemini, oh boy, did they ever. And they really wrote history in the Apollo days of the American space program. That leaves one more astronaut of this panel, the one who flew in Gemini and twice in Apollo to become the last man on the moon, Gene Cernan. As a rather famous radio newsman likes to say, now you're about to hear the rest of the story. The story of Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, through the memories of the men who lived those programs and became true American heroes in the process. So let us turn back time and begin at the beginning with Alan Shepard and Wally Schirra, if we may. Fellas, do you remember the day when the 2 of you were first introduced to the public?
Well, thank you for finally giving us an opportunity, Roy. It's pretty easy to tell that you've been a reporter most of your life. I hope that in the next hour and a half or so we'll be able to interpret your remarks properly. The story, the real story is told from the inside. Let me say, first of all, with respect to the initial selection process, you indicated that NASA was created. Actually, the NAC had been in business for many, many years prior to that time. And when President Eisenhower, in the rush in the aftermath of the Sputnik, decided to get involved with the Man in Space program and decided to make it a public, open program run not by the military but by a civilian agency. They chose to rename the National Advisory Committee of Aeronautics, which had been an admirable government agency many years, to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Assigned them the responsibility of choosing astronauts to fly on the top of military rockets. The NASA people said, of course, they would be delighted to manage the program from an engineering point of view, but all of their test pilots, with maybe one exception, had long gray beards and were walking with canes, and so Eisenhower said, well, let's go to the military. Went through a selection process of astronauts who had all been test pilots, came up with a solution that was supposedly equal between the services. 3 Air Force, 3 Navy, and 1 Marine. I don't know whether that means that 1 Marine is worth 3 Navy or... In any event, most of us had a great deal of test flying. We'd already been flying higher and faster than we talked about very much in those days. And when we were announced, and all of a sudden we became overnight heroes in the eyes of some of our reporting friends over here, it was a strange feeling to us because, I mean, after all, we were just going to go ahead and continue to do what we had been doing all of our lives. So having interpreted some of your remarks, I'll turn it over to you, Skyray, and see if you want to interpret some more of his remarks.
Isn't it wonderful, Wally? I have my own interpreter who comes here with me. Go ahead.
Can we turn his mic off, Al? Oddly enough, we were told it would be thrilling to get in this capsule on top of a rocket to go around the world. And I sat there, having been ordered to Washington for this presentation, with great hesitation that I think that was a great idea. They said, well, don't worry, we're going to send some monkeys or chimpanzees first. I knew I wanted out of there then. I was very happy at Patuxent testing the F-4, which you have a model of back here, and I thought I'd be a squadron skipper shortly and maybe get a carrier in the future, but I wasn't about to get in this can on top of a rocket. So I talked to some of my friends, and Bob Elder sitting in the audience, and he said, Schirra, if you want to go higher, farther, and faster, this is the way to do it. I wish you hadn't told me that, Bob. We had a lot of fun with it. We worked together very closely. The 7 of us became brothers with great competition, as you may detect already, but the fun of it was that we really did form a brotherhood. I guess my favorite memory, though, Al, if I think back on it, when I finally leaped off after the first 4 guys went, there was a picture, and there were the 9, 2 of which are standing here, and Tweety Conrad was standing there with his fingers crossed as they watched me have a liftoff. And you must remember, we used the word liftoff in those days, not blast off. We took a blast before liftoff. Roy?
Okay. I would like to add one thing that we found out shortly after we had been reported on board. As I said before, a lot of people thought we were crazy. We didn't really bother us too much because it was obviously a natural extension of being crazy as a test pilot. But we ran into 2 other groups of individuals with whom we found out early in life we had to deal with. One was the medical community, who introduced us to primates. I don't know, I never knew what a primate was until we were involved in the astronaut program. The other, of course, was a group of engineers within NASA who had been involved in the early stages of the design process of the Mercury nose cone. The medics seemed to think that physiologically and psychologically somehow flying at high speeds and high altitudes was not only going to change our entire personalities and our entire physiological systems, and that we wouldn't be able to operate effectively. The second group of engineers who designed the Mercury nose cone were convinced that it could be totally done automatically. There was no need to have any kind of a pilot on board, experienced or otherwise. So we really had to contend right from day one with these two groups of people. Actually, we didn't make out too well with the medics. They did, in fact, fly a couple of primates before one of us had the chance to go. On the other hand, we made out a little bit better with the engineers. We said, first of all, even though this nose cone didn't look like an airplane from the outside, we wanted it to fly like an airplane from the inside. And we wanted to give the pilot a chance to have some control over the vehicle just in case it happened to go sideways shortly after takeoff. They sort of begrudgingly agreed and gave us a little bit here and there. Finally, we came to one point that we really had a difficulty with. You know, when you fly airplanes, normally you look out of a windshield. And if you lose the instruments, you rely upon the view outside the windshield to give you some control over what the airplane is doing, where it's going. The original nose cone for Mercury did not have a windshield. It had a porthole up here and a porthole down there, and we said, well, now, we have to be fairly precise in firing the rockets when we come back in, so we'll land within a few miles of where we're supposed to. They said, yes, that's correct. And we said, well, what do we do if the jets don't work automatically? He said, well, you have some needles up here, and you fly and keep the needles where they're supposed to. We said, well, that's fine. What do we do if the needles are not working properly? And he said, well, you have a periscope that looks straight down toward the Earth. And I don't know about you multi-engine pilots, but us fighter pilots never flew looking straight down. There was a long series of discussions about the time delay and the extra cost and everything to put a windshield in there. They finally did. And wouldn't you know, on the very last Mercury mission, there was a failure of the attitude instruments, and the pilot, Gordon Cooper, was able to relatively precisely line it up and bring that baby back in safely. So we beat the engineers and we came out even with the medics.
Very good.
Well, the Apollo program, of course, was fantastic. And as it wound up, the Russians were still not to be denied at that time. By the time Mercury closed out, the Russians had flown a woman, Valentina Tereshkova, and a couple of cosmonauts. Matter of fact, one of them, Alexei Leonov, flying in the two-man Voskhod spacecraft, actually performed the first spacewalk during that mission. Jim Lovell, this brings us into Gemini, our two-man spacecraft, a tremendously important program which is perhaps almost forgotten today, but not by those of us who were there observing what you were doing at the time. And with Gemini 4, mission control, you may remember, moved to Houston. Wally and Tom Stafford, as a matter of fact, were supposed to have docked with an unmanned Agena target vehicle, and that target blew up on its way into space. So the agency officials, not to be outdone and needing to do something rather good at the time, decided to have you and Frank Borman do a rendezvous. You were in 7, Stafford and Schirra were in 6, so we newsfellers, Alan, called this Mission 76, of course. Even though it was close to Christmas, 1965, we took that liberty. And Jim, why don't you pick up the story from there?
Well, Roy, the story really started back with Gemini 6 and when they had problems with their Agena. And it would give you a good example of how NASA can, and leadership really, can make changes that would really promote the program and keep it going. Because they said, you know, with the Agena out of the way, why don't we launch Gemini 7, a 2-week mission? That was myself and Frank Borman. And by the way, 2 weeks with Frank Borman any place was a challenge, I have to tell you that right now. So we took off on this 2-week mission. We had a different type of a suit, no EVAs or anything like that. We had an entirely cloth suit. The only time this particular pressure suit was ever used had a cloth helmet on it. And of course, 2 weeks in a thing not much bigger than a tin can, I immediately tried to get out of my suit. And I slipped it lower and lower once we found out the spacecraft wasn't leaking. Frank wanted to get out of his suit too, and it took him 3 days to talk to those doctors, Al, that before we were allowed to even get out of our suits. Gemini 6 was supposed to rendezvous with us, and of course, maybe Wally can tell you about that, and I'll let that go by. But finally, they did rendezvous, and I can recall very vividly watching Gemini 6 come up. It was at nighttime, and he and Tom Stafford were coming closer to us as we stood up there, waited as the target. And that was really, of course, the first attempt at a rendezvous, one of our leading aspects into Apollo. In fact, the whole Gemini program was one of research and development, EVA, rendezvous, dockings, and long-term missions. I'll leave you with one thing before I give it over to Wally about that aspect of the Gemini program. But years later, Frank Borman was chairman of Eastern Airlines. I had also retired. I flew down in one of his Eastern Airline planes just before the demise of Eastern Airlines. And when I got out of the at the Miami airport, I met Frank at the airport, and I said, you know, Frank, I swear that the food you're serving on Eastern was left over from our Gemini 7 flight back there. He never appreciated my humor. Wally, why don't you tell him about the rendezvous?
Well, Jim made a point about Gemini being the stepping stone from Mercury, or at least getting ready for Apollo. And one other area you left out is a precisely guided reentry, in that if one does not have, and this is one of the guys who could talk about it, a precisely guided reentry from the moon, you could have a bad day. And I'm sure most of you have seen Apollo 13, and we'll hear more about that from Jim later. But we were quite thrilled to do this rendezvous. I guess it was the first time we did anything in the American space program that the Soviets had not done. They had flown 2 spacecraft simultaneously within miles of each other. And I continue to say that if you talk about rendezvous, it's sort of like a man and a woman walking down on opposite sides of a busy street. If the man waves with the woman, that's just a passing acquaintance. That's not a rendezvous. Now, if you can go across the street and nibble on her ear, that's a rendezvous. Well, that's essentially what we did. But in addition to that, we had the fun of realizing that Jim Lovell, myself, and Tom Stafford, although we made the mistake of going in the Air Force, were all Naval Academy graduates. Mm-hmm. Now, the serious part of the mission was to get close enough to Gemini 7 to hold up a sign, which I did, and here's Borman looking at it, and it says, "Beat Army." I thought I was way ahead, but Borman said, "That sign looks like it says beat Navy." No, no, no. Frank got to me on that one. So once in a while we lose these rounds. But the fun of the mission was when we finally were done, we did a precisely guided reentry and landed within 4 miles of the aircraft carrier. It was out of position by 4 miles. And then we briefed Jim and Frank Borman on how to land, and they landed closer to the carrier than we did. So again, they won, but we did prove a precisely done rendezvous mission, a precisely done reentry would work. And of course, Gemini then proved its way. We had done the spacewalk, we had done the rendezvous, we had done 2 weeks in space, and we did a precisely guided reentry. A heck of a good feeling for Gemini.
Matter of fact, Gemini was a tremendously important program. And since we're on it, Neil Armstrong, you were testing the Gemini controllers back in the X-15 program before you even became an astronaut. Seems to me during your mission, Gemini 8, you came pretty close to buying the farm at one point there, didn't you?
We had we took, as Wally said, took great pride in landing close to our carrier, and usually we could land within a mile. And our carrier was located in the Caribbean, and I landed by Okinawa. I think it's a record that'll never be broken. Little short circuits can cause lots of big problems. Gemini, of course, didn't really come, it flew before Apollo, but it happened after the Apollo program was committed, when all of us recognized that we didn't know very much about space and we had very little experience. And if we were going to go off to the moon and fly rendezvous spacecraft around the moon and navigate our way there and back, we very well better learn how to do it here on Earth. And Gemini, which really was an advanced Mercury, a two-place Mercury, was intended to give us that experience. Had a couple of important characteristics. The previous spacecraft, Mercury and the Voskhod, or Vostok, had no ability to navigate, except as Al pointed out, they managed to put a window in, and so they could look out and say, "Hey, we're over Florida." That was about the best you could do for navigation. Thank goodness they did insist on those windows. For navigation, we used an inertial navigation system, a so-called stable table and computer. In those days, most shipboard computers, inertial navigators, and airplanes of the time were two-dimensional systems. The advantage of a two-dimensional inertial navigation system is that errors do not propagate. They tend to be oscillatory or sinusoidal. And an airplane, although it's a three-dimensional machine, has an altimeter input into the system, which makes it essentially a two-axis problem. The first experience I had in a three-dimensional inertial navigating system was in the X-15, an airplane that could fly outside the atmosphere and hence have no altitude reference. In this case, the altitude component, or the vertical component of the navigation system, is an unstable calculation. And the reason for that is if you have a little error and you're not at quite the altitude you're supposed to be, the G, your local gravitational force, has also changed because you're at the wrong altitude. And that computation tends to be unstable. This manifested itself in the X-15. It flew in about a 10-minute flight with an altitude reading on the inertial system that after landing would say you were still at 100,000 feet. So that would not be a satisfactory navigation system for flying to the moon. The Gemini solved this problem by two ways. First, it only used the inertial part of the system, the stable platform, when it was under power or flying back through the atmosphere. And second, rather than an analog computer, which the X-15 had used, the reason the X-15 used analog computer is that digital computers were far too slow in those days to do the job. Analog computers were lightning fast, but very poor in accuracy. By the time we got to Gemini, we had a digital computer which was very good in accuracy, which we needed, but this computer by today's standards was extremely primitive. It could add in 140 microseconds, subtract in 240, and divide in about 480 microseconds. That means that the average laptop that you can buy at the mall was somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 times faster than the Gemini computer. It had no screen, no graphics, no letters. It had a keyboard with 13 keys, 0 to 9, clear, enter. And it had for output just one little register of 7 numbers. And that was the complete way we computed space navigation in those days. Remarkable what changes have occurred in the next 30 years.
Okay. Following Neil's flight, next up was Gemini 9. Of course, that was a piece of cake for you, wasn't it, Gene Cernan? A piece of cake as you began finding out that walking in space wasn't all that easy.
Roy, I got to say, appreciate being introduced as the last man on the moon, but that really is getting old. He's first out here, first man to walk in space, first man to go in space, first man to wet his pants on a pad. Wally's the first guy you didn't know that about Al Shepard, did you? Wally's the first guy to get a cold in space, and the first guy, last guy, and always the guy to tell a bad joke. He's still doing that, right, Jack? Jim's the first guy to almost get lost in space. He's the first guy to go by if you call Jim, "Hey, Tom," he just somehow comes running. Fame has gone to his head. Neil is known for the first man to land on the moon, but the true fact of life, he's the first man to almost run out of gas trying to land on the moon. I think he had 10 or 15 seconds left. And when you're last, there's not much else to say. These guys, I had trouble finding a place to land on the moon after these guys. Anyway, I feel privileged to be up here myself. I sort of came into the program in the third group, and was somehow fortunate enough to be selected very early in a program which gave me a chance to fly on Gemini. And I was originally selected to fly on Gemini 9, and we lost a few guys along the way. I know more recently you all remember Challenger. We had a significant accident, I'm sure Roy will get into a little bit, called Apollo 1, which was a fire on a pad. But prior to that, there were a lot of unpublicized accidents. Guys going down in airplanes, and the prime crew on Gemini 9, of which I was a backup on, was not scheduled to fly. I was a backup with Tom Stafford. Had an accident, crashed in bad weather in St. Louis into the McDonald factory way back in February 1966. Prior to that, Tom and I had been told if we kept our nose clean, we might get to fly Gemini 12. As it was, we had after the accident, had about 2 months to get prepared. Actually ended up to be 3 months to fly Gemini 9. Gemini 9 was a very ambitious flight in that we were going to build, as all the Mercury and Gemini flights did on each other. We are going to build upon the rendezvous. We're going to build upon Neil's docking with the Agena. Things that had already been done, but we wanted to verify we could do them under different circumstances, and build upon EVA, extravehicular activity, spacewalking. Ed White was the first American, the second human being ever get out of a spacecraft. The pictures of Ed today on Gemini 4 are classic, and Ed had a spectacular 20-some-odd minutes out in space, had a space gun, and came back. And to the rest of us, it indeed looked like a piece of cake, Roy. Mm-hmm. Neil's co-pilot on Gemini 8, Dave Scott, was supposed to walk in space. And had he walked in space, I think we would have learned a lot more than we knew before my turn came on Gemini 9. But we were taking a quantum leap because we had no spacewalks between Ed's 20 minutes and the challenge that was given me on Gemini 9. It was to be about a 3-hour spacewalk. I was to get out of the spacecraft, and after getting familiar with what it felt like to walk around the world at 17,000 miles an hour, that sort of sounds crazy, doesn't it? To go in the back of the Gemini spacecraft and basically assemble a Buck Rogers type backpack, the kind you've seen them flying around in shuttle. Seems to be everyday commonplace today. It wasn't then. As a matter of fact, that backpack was firing hot rocket engine gases, so someone, and I should have suspected something when someone fitted me for those Chromel steel pants to keep from burning through my spacesuit. But you know, I was a rookie, and someone gave me a chance to fly, and I was going to go come hell or high water. You point me in the right direction, and I'm going. And we were pretty ambitious, and we didn't really appreciate too much about Newton's laws of motion. You know, F equals ma. When you push, something pushes back in zero gravity. When you try and turn a valve, the valve turns back. And I found myself with no footholds and a bicycle bar for a handhold, trying to turn valves on this backpack I was going to basically assemble and extend the arms to, and every time I pushed down, it pushed back, and I'd go sort of floating sideways and upside down in space. Overpowered my spacesuit's environmental control system. The whole visor got all fogged up, and eventually got into the backpack, a little late and a little exhausted, and was ready to fly. I thought anyway, a little disappointed I didn't, but a decision was made that, hey, maybe we've taken it too far. Maybe we've got some questions that need answers before we try and do this again. And we terminated my spacewalk after somewhere between 2.5 and 3 hours. I'd like to think that maybe we learned a little bit from that flight, although at the time, it was like that movie we saw this morning, where the F-18 was coming aboard, and he said, boy, I want to do it right to the second. I want to do it right. I don't want to boulder. I want to come in. I owe it to the air group. I owe it to the squadron. I owe it to the guys. I felt after Gemini 9 that maybe I let somebody down. There was a lot we had to prove. We had to get to the moon in a very short period of time, and we couldn't allow any one of our missions not to be successful in some way or another. And although we rendezvoused several times on Gemini 9, the EVA was a big part of it. In retrospect, we redesigned the cooling system in our Apollo suits. We learned something about the necessity to anchor our feet for our spacewalks. Once you do that, you can pick up a Mack truck in space. We learned a little bit about our training. We went into underwater training facilities, which they use all the time now in shuttle. So in retrospect, maybe we did learn something from the potential mishaps. A few little side notes to the Gemini 9 flight that we didn't talk about, we laughed about this morning, Wally and I did at breakfast. We have some unwritten rules. Everyone wants to know, you know, Wally, what would you have done? Al, what would you have done if your Redstone blew up on a pad? Wally, what would you have done on Gemini 6 when the engines fired and shut down, and you know, and you could have ejected? And Neil, what would you have done if you couldn't have gone off the surface of the moon? And people always ask the questions, what you might have done, the old what if. Well, thank God we don't have the answers to those questions. I'm not sure we sort of legislated out the fact that we would not allow those kind of failures to occur. And on Gemini 9, Tom Stafford and I knew, and it's the last thing Tom did before we suited up, before we actually got into the spacecraft. Tom and I knew that had I had a real problem, in retrospect it was a real problem, and not been able to get back in, that Tom would have had to pull the umbilical out, close the hatch, and come home alone. It's fun to laugh about that today. It's fun to talk about it today. But those are the kinds of risks, and those are the kinds of things we had to do. Jim Lovell went to the moon on Apollo 8. Remember, he also went to the moon on Apollo 13. He's here today because he took a lunar module with him on Apollo 13. He didn't have a lunar module on Apollo 8. And yet the risk was manageable. The necessity to go to the moon at that time dictated some of the risk we took. And I think you'll find that throughout this discussion, that those are the decisions we had to confront, and do something about at the time. One other little thing that at least I was led to believe at the time, had we flown Gemini 12, and it was wild talk at the time, and maybe Al and Wally know more about it than I do, but Tom Stafford told me that had the Gemini 9 accident not occurred and had the Russian program accelerated to the point that they might orbit the moon, it was possible that Gemini 12 could have jumped on top of an Agena with a little extra boost, and they would have shot us around the moon back in 1966. Now, I'm sort of glad that things happened the way they did in retrospect, but that really would have been an eye-opener at the time. I'm not sure we could have pulled that one off.
Alan, you were very instrumental in running the astronaut office at that time. Can you confirm or deny this report that Cernan has just given us about Gemini 12?
Actually, I would have no comment on that.
You think it still goes on and on and on. Jim, I know that
if you think it's hard to say no comment, it is difficult.
Jim, I know that you flew as commander of the mission that finally resolved most of those problems of weightlessness, where Buzz Aldrin came up with some pretty good ideas. And for lack of time right now, I don't think we need to elaborate except to say that Buzz had some pretty good answers, didn't he?
That's right. I'll just make one or two comments. Gemini 12 finally did all the basic work that was required for extravehicular activity. We actually leased a boys' swimming pool and a boys' school up in Boston and put Buzz under the water in a spacesuit, which is just as good as in space. Made him neutrally buoyant, and then we went through some of the basic techniques, how to get away from the problems that Gene had, and later on in 10 and 11, they all had the same problems. Dick Gordon overheated. Mm-hmm. We finally figured out how to put tow holds, hand holds, the type of equipment to use. And so one of the major accomplishments of 12 was to finally get the EVA squared away, which we did very successfully. And as Gene mentioned, we now have water tanks at most of our centers, and that's where we do all our work, and so the Russians do the same thing.
You know, what's coming through rather clearly is how much pioneering was going on here, how much ingenuity was being exercised. Because you guys were ad-libbing, weren't you? Every inch of the way, everything that had to happen during Mercury and Gemini was being generated from within, because nobody had ever done it before.
Wally? I'd like to add a point we haven't made clear. We, in aviation, have one control stick, and the left hand typically is busy with the throttle. To effect a rendezvous and to dock, we had a control stick in our left hand. Most of you are familiar with pitch, roll, and yaw. We had to have yaw on that stick, on the right-hand stick. On the left-hand stick, we had forward, back, up, down, right, and left. And that permitted a whole new avenue of flight in orbit where we could rendezvous and dock. And that was a whole new adventure for us. Fortunately, Jim Lovell and I are left-handed. The other guys had to learn how to fly left-handed. That helped.
Well, finally, folks, it was the time of Apollo. And at the very outset, before the program could really start to fly, disaster struck. Of course, that's Apollo 1 that was alluded to here just a few moments ago. First manned mission, which was being readied when a fatal design flaw struck, killing Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. It took 21 months to redesign and to rebuild the Apollo, and the Russians were rather quiet during that time as they worked on their next generation spacecraft, the Soyuz. Matter of fact, on its first test flight, parachutes failed on re-entry, and a cosmonaut, Vladimir Komarov, was killed. Also, during that same 21 months, you may remember that fellow named von Braun was successfully testing something called Saturn V, that 5-story tall, huge rocket. Now, the Russians were still active. They were busy during that time. But finally, in October 1988, after all this interim, the question then became one of, would the Apollo spacecraft fly? And Wally, you got Apollo 7. That was the mission that rang it out.
Well, it was a tough one for us. I really wanted to rename Apollo 7 Phoenix, which would have been appropriate, but NASA didn't like that. They thought 7 was a nice, funny name. So we stuck with Apollo 7. The interesting part of that time frame, while we're ready to go, Werner von Braun was kept asking me to try my German accent and said, Wally, tell the story about the astronauts and the cosmonauts. Ja, Werner. So you have to imagine now, we're anxiously getting ready to go to the moon and back, and we're conjecturing this scene where a spacecraft with CCCP on it, SSR on it, and another spacecraft, USA, land on the moon simultaneously. A hatch opens in each, out comes a cosmonaut, out comes an astronaut. They walk over to each other and stick their bubble helmets together. Hello, Hans. Hello, Fritz. Now we speak German. Well, that was the fun of those days, but to get Apollo 7 ready, we had to change the hatch. We had a hatch initially that would pressurize, much like a submarine hatch. As the pressure increased, the hatch sealed tighter and tighter. And that was one of the things that caused the disaster of Apollo 1 once the fire started. So we had a swing open hatch. We changed the environment slightly. We had almost a sea level atmosphere with nitrogen and oxygen in the spacecraft to launch, where Apollo 1 had pure oxygen, so if anything started, you had an incendiary cause right away. So they of course had that problem. We would rejuvenate the atmosphere within the Apollo by adding oxygen as the other gases bled off during flight. So eventually we had a pure oxygen flight. The interesting part of that all was that they were worried about the fire to a point where they said, we have to shave all your hair off. And I said, hey, look, we're going to be up there for 11 days. It's going to start growing back again. Oh, that's right. We won't do that. We could take nothing to read, no toys to play with. It was a pretty darn long flight. And as a fighter pilot, an hour and a half is a long day. And here I am logging 11 days in that beauty. That was a tough one. Well, what we did, of course, was do all the tests that were required for the spacecraft in Earth orbit to prove it could go to the moon and back. And it's quite often you hear us say moon and back, it's one word. There are no commas, no hyphens. Moon and back is one word. With that thought in mind, we had to endure for 11 days. And I can recall very vividly one of the more major experiments I conducted was a little metal band on my watch that had the calendar of October 1968. And I very dutifully scratched off every day but the last. I forgot to scratch the last day off. That was probably the biggest event I had on that flight. That's not really true. One of my favorite stories about the Germans, I guess, was Gunther Wendt was our pad leader. And we had this one window, which was Alan was referring to earlier, where you could look out in front. And the last person who could look out that window before launch was Don Isley, who sat in the middle couch, or was lying on the middle couch. And he could look into the White Room where all the preparation for the launch was conducted until everybody left. And the last man to leave the White Room was Gunther Wendt. And Don Isley looked out the window and said, I wonder where Gunther Wendt.
Cernan saying, see what I mean? Gene mentioned the fact that in the course of that flight, also, Wally, you became the first man to have a cold in space. Go ahead, Shep.
I just want to make one point, a serious point about the Apollo 1 fire. And let me say, first of all, that taking a look at the entire record of NASA as far as manned spaceflight is concerned, we have flown over 125 missions, I believe it is right now, manned missions, and we've only had fatalities on 2, so it's an outstanding record. And it's much better than was ever predicted back in the early days. But you say to yourself, what happened in the case of the Apollo 1 fire? What happened in the case of Challenger? And you recognize a couple of similar situations. You have, in the Apollo 1 fire particularly, perhaps some of the pressure of the Cold War was still there, the competition with the Soviets. But there was certainly a sense of success in all the Mercury missions and all the Gemini missions, maybe a little bit too much pressure rushing into Apollo. But I think below that was a sense of complacency, a sense of overconfidence, which really permeated the entire system, including us. I think the situation occurred because we had been so successful in the earlier flights of Mercury and Gemini. I think the same sort of complacency and overconfidence occurred just initially, just prior to the Challenger, but very, very successful shuttle missions. And the point I would like to make, and I reconsider myself in the years that have passed, is that regardless of how smart, how successful one has been, I don't care who the individual is, there's always that chance of overconfidence and complacency, which led to the demise of our comrades.
Serious words. Well, during that era, once Wally and his crew had proved that through Apollo 7 that Apollo could fly, they were still having some trouble developing the lunar excursion module, that jeep that was going to allow men to run around on the moon. Meanwhile, the officials were still quite some concerned that the Russians might try to send some cosmonauts out around the moon, particularly because they had flown some Zond spacecraft, some unmanned spacecraft, which had indeed flown out around the moon and come back. And their concern was, could the Russians perhaps send somebody up there not to land but to fly around the moon? And so it was decided that Apollo 8 would be flown, the flight of Apollo 8, the Christmas flight, to send 3 astronauts to orbit the moon but not to land there. And Jim, you were a key man on that flight.
This actually was a very good lesson in leadership. As Roy had said, the Soviets at that time were very serious about going to the moon. They had a program like our Apollo program, working simultaneously with ours, had built a huge booster, a rocket called the N1, built 10 of them, flew 4, none of them worked. But they still wanted to put a man around the moon, and so they had the Proton rocket, and they did. They sent a couple Zond vehicles around the moon with animals, but then they hesitated. They hesitated about putting people on board for a flight around the moon, which they could have done in the fall of 1968. Meanwhile, in this country, the lunar module not ready. Wally proved the command module was ready. The Saturn V, we had some problems with it, but we decided that it would be okay. And in every kind of a business, whether it's the Navy or private enterprise or the space program, sometime you have to take calculated risks. You can't be complacent, but you have to take calculated risks. And they said, the vehicle, the command module, the rocket are ready, let's send Apollo 8 around the moon. And that's how it came to pass that on December 21st, 1968, Borman, Anders, and myself were the first 3 people to fly the Saturn V, to leave the confines of the Earth, to be captured by another body, to see the far side of the moon for the very first time, and to go around the moon. This was really the high point of my space career. To bring to everybody is when we went around the moon and looked back at the Earth. And those of you who perhaps have seen the movie of Apollo 13, you might see Hanks doing this, and I'm sorry that Tom's not here. I know you all wanted Tom, but had to be satisfied with the real thing today. But he put his thumb up to the window and he completely hid the Earth. Now you have to think about that for a while. Everything that I ever knew, my life, my loved ones, the Navy, everything, the whole world was behind my thumb. And it gave me the feeling of really how insignificant we really all are. We're on a rather small body out there, looks completely uninhabited, and yet, you know, there are about 5 billion people all striving for the same things out of life. We're going around a star that's a normal star, nothing spectacular about that star, tucked on the outer edge of a big nebula called, the Milky Way. And yet, you know that you have to get back there. And so that really gave me the feeling of how fortunate we all are to be able to do this and to see what we have here back on Earth and to enjoy it.
There was something else you did on that flight too, Jim. You reminded us all that perhaps religion had its place in the space program too. Do you remember the incident to which I refer?
As we went around the moon the very first time, Bill Anders, in charge of photography, was taking pictures of craters. Frank Borman and I were looking out ahead as the lunar surface came across to us, and suddenly as we went around the far side and came up to the near side, out of the lunar horizon came really a beautiful sight, and that was the Earth. From the position of the moon, the only color you can really see is the Earth. The moon is almost all shades of gray. Sun you can't look at. Stars, they're washed out if the sun and the moon happen to be in your field of view. Well, Frank and I looked at that and said, by gosh, that would make an interesting photograph. We ought to take a picture of it. Anders, in charge of photography, did not see the scene, but heard our discussion, said, hold it. We have only so many frames of film, can't waste them on the Earth, we have to take pictures of the craters of the moon. Then Bill looked up and said, by gosh, we ought to take a picture of that. All 3 of us grabbed cameras, all 3 of us took pictures of the Earth coming out of the lunar horizon. One of those pictures became very famous. Everybody in this room has seen that photograph sometime in your life. It's called Earthrise, made into a stamp in 1969. It's been on every publication known to man. Now, in your travels, should you happen to run into Frank Borman, ask Frank who took that picture. He will say, I was the commander of that flight, obviously it's my photograph. Should you run into Bill Anders, ask him the same question. He'll say, I was the photographer, I took the picture. Ladies and gentlemen, I took that picture.
Every time you hear it from a different guy, you get a different answer. That was the same crew, by the way, that also read Back to Earth on Christmas Eve. And in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the thing that made some of us so-called hard-bitten news people watching what was going on literally made us cry. Here were men, United States astronauts, flying around the moon and remembering that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Well, as Jim just mentioned, the Russians were having a tough time. Their test vehicle, the N-1, had blown up. And about that time, our Apollo 9 tested a strange device, lunar jeep, followed by, if you will, an all-up dress rehearsal. Now, I mentioned the LEM still wasn't quite ready, but it was decided that somehow or another, Apollo 10 should go up to the moon and fly around it. And Gene Cernan, you flew on that flight. You went all the way down to within 10 miles of the Sea of Tranquility, but you didn't land. Was it because the LEM wasn't ready or you weren't ready?
It's a long way to go without, 50,000 feet's awful close after 250,000 miles. If Lovell had flown the mission he was supposed to, Neil might have been the third man to walk on the moon. Apollo 9 did fly the lunar module for the first time, but it was in Earth orbit. So up came Apollo 10, which was originally the fourth scheduled Apollo flight, which originally was going to take a shot at being the first landing. And obviously, a lot of things changed along the way. There was even some consideration after Apollo 8 that Apollo 10 might take a shot at it. But we didn't really have enough experience with the LEM. We had no experience with the LEM out in far Earth orbit, or certainly not around the moon. So it was decided that Apollo 10 would go ahead and fly on schedule, take the LEM that was planned for us to fly, which was a little heavier than the one Neil eventually flew with, and really fly Neil's flight, with the exception of the last 47,000 feet. And people, say, well, that must have been disappointing. Let me tell you, that was my first trip on a Saturn V, my second space flight, and I was going to go out to the moon. And I want to tell you, it was not disappointing. Whether we landed or not, I mean, it was just part of the program. A lot of people said, well, if you're going to take the risk of launch, leaving Earth orbit, going into lunar orbit, separating from the mothership, going down, you ought to go the rest of the way and land. And the other folks, other half of the room said, well, let's take all that, let's go that far and not land. Software, by the way, wasn't quite ready. It really probably wasn't even ready for Neil when he flew. The landing software, as you might remember by all the alarms they had when they landed. So we took Snoopy, Charlie Brown and Snoopy were the name of our spacecraft, and did just that. We snooped around the surface of the moon, took pictures so that Neil would know where he's going. As I have said in the past, that guys like Schirra and Shepard painted the yellow line in the sky for the rest of us to follow. I think Apollo 10 painted the yellow line in the sky so Neil wouldn't get lost right down to that 47,000 foot mark. I do have one first, by the way. After we went down a couple times over the landing site, looked around and separated our lunar module, somehow a computer switch got put in the wrong position, and we won't discuss how and why. And our lunar module spun out of control, passing over the lunar surface at several thousand miles an hour, not too high off the top of those mountains. And somebody yelled to the entire world through an open mic, "Golly gee whiz, what the heck happened?" It was something like that, and that was... The words were close. You can interpret them any way you want. So I'm the first guy to have sworn in space. But Apollo 10 did come back. We found a few anomalies that, fortunately for Neil, would have given him trouble in the landing radar and a couple other places. And by the way, just in case we did have any aspirations of landing, and Wally asked me this morning, could you have really landed on 10? Of course, with the arrogance of a I got to be careful, an attack pilot. I know there's a lot of fighter pilots out there. With the arrogance of an attack pilot, I said, hell yes, Wally, we could have landed. The problem was they short fueled us and we couldn't have got off the surface, which sort of entered into our decision making at the time. But came back and turned the reins over to, I don't know if I've missed anything in Apollo 10, but turned the reins over to Neil to get the job done, and obviously he did it extremely well.
Okay, that brings us right up to Apollo 11, doesn't it, Neil? Heavens, it was 30 years ago. What do you remember most over that long range?
First, I think the level of confidence we had. We had a lot of confidence because Jim's told you about the flight of Apollo 8. It proved that we could go to the moon. The Saturn V would get up there. They could navigate their way around. Now they could successfully come back and land on Earth. And Gene's told you about in 10, they took the lunar module along for the first time to the moon. It fired its engines, which is important to us because we wanted to. These very highly proven engines now had flown twice in space and run a very short amount of time in each flight. So we had a high level of confidence that if we could just match their performance, we could get up to the moon. There were only 3 phases of the flight that hadn't been demonstrated up to that point. That was the descent, working on the surface, and launching back into lunar orbit. Now, none of those were trivial, but in my view, the descent was far the most critical and the most difficult. The orbital speed around the moon is about 5,500 feet per second, about 3,500 knots. And to come from that orbit down to the surface, the higher the orbit is, the more fuel you'll need to get down. The lower the orbit, the more possibility is that you'll make a new crater and they'll name it after you. So we picked kind of a middle ground that Gene tested, his roughly the 50,000 foot area, 10-mile area above the surface, as our best compromise. It turns out that the fuel required to get any vehicle from that orbit down to the surface is about equal to half its weight. In our case, our lunar module, fully fueled with both stages, weighed about 32,000 pounds. So we needed about 16,000 pounds to get down to the surface, another 1,000 pounds roughly to hover around the area and find a place to land. Now, the gravity at the moon is 1/6 of Earth. So to support a roughly 15,000 pound vehicle at that point, you need an engine that has a thrust of 2,500 pounds. And just like a helicopter or a Harrier or any other VTOL machine, you need a substantial amount of throttle ability in that range to be able to adjust your descent rate and make a successful landing. The problem was there hadn't been any throttleable rockets. My first rocket experience was on the LR-8, or what the Navy, in the Navy LR-11 in the Air Force, which was used on the X-1 airplanes and the Douglas skyrockets. That had 4 chambers, each one 1,500 pounds thrust, so you could have 1,500, 3,000, 4,500, or 6,000 pounds of thrust, but no throttling. The LR-11 99 engine had a little bit of throttling, but not much. And trying to figure out a way to throttle a rocket engine was a really big challenge. Apollo was a really well-funded project, we would have to admit. And that afforded us the luxury of developing a couple of competing technologies for the critical areas, and certainly the throttling descent engine was one. The first technique that for the rocket scientists among you was to throttle it by injecting an inert gas into the propellant streams upstream of the rocket chamber. And the second approach used very special flow valves using cavitating venturis. Now both of these were pretty high-tech, high-risk kinds of jobs, but surprisingly, they both worked pretty well. We picked the cavitating venturi method as the one to go with. It had pretty good throttle ability, at least in the low throttle ranges where you needed it for hover, and it was very smooth. There were certain areas of the throttle range that we couldn't use because the mixture ratio out of the cavitating venturis was unpredictable and you get excessive erosion. And so like a lot of airplanes where you can't fly in a certain throttle range, this was one of those kinds of things. It worked very well. The engine was also not very high-tech. It was a pressure-fed engine, not a turbopump-fed engine. Used 1,600 psi nitrogen gas in supercritical state to pressurize the fuel tank, and the engine pressures were a remarkable about 100 psi only at maximum thrust. I think there were a lot of technical triumphs in Apollo, but that's one that sticks out in my mind, probably because it was extremely important to me that it worked. And just to point out, I talked earlier about inertial navigation systems and their ability to require an altitude reference. Gene mentioned the landing radar. That was the thing that we used for the altitude reference to keep the inertial scheme from diverging.
Well, the big thing is you did it. As a matter of fact, I remember once interviewing Wernher von Braun about 10 years after the fact, and I said to him, Dr. von Braun, when you were selling the United States on the idea that your Saturn V would take men to the moon, were you really sure that it could do the job? Well, of course, he hadn't been all that sure, but he sold it. And he looked squarely into my camera, and he said, well, you see, Mr. Neal, I don't have to answer that question because, you see, we did it. Perfect answer to a lousy question. Following Apollo 11, however, the United States space program, although we didn't really think of it at the time, but it was on its way downhill. The impetus was gone. You had won the race. You'd gone there. You'd done it. Men had been to the moon. So along came Apollo 12, very successful follow-on. But it remained for Jim Lovell and the Apollo 13 crew to enact what I consider to this day to be one of the truly amazing adventure stories of our time. Of course, I'm referring to Apollo 13, subject of a movie, and now a synonym in these United States for trial and tribulation and survival. Jim, let's hear the story as you remember it.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people here know the story of Apollo 13, but it's kind of interesting how it got started. If you all remember President Kennedy's speech way back in 1961, just a few weeks after Al Shepard made his suborbital flight, he told Congress and then down at the Rice University that essentially we plan to land a man on the moon and bring him home safely before the end of the decade. I don't think anyone here heard him say, I certainly didn't, that we plan to land a man on the moon for the purpose of scientific exploration, to find out what the moon consisted of, the origin of the solar system or the origin of the moon itself. He basically was putting out a gauntlet to the technology of this country and to the world that we had the ability to put a man on the moon and bring him back safely before the end of the decade. So, of course, we will never know if he really thought that was going to be true or not. Of course, as you know from Neil, we did it 6 months before the end of the decade. By the time Apollo 13 rolled around, and we had brought back a lot of material from the mare, or the seas, of where Apollo 11 landed and Apollo 12, the geologists finally came to us, the scientists, and said, look, we have plenty of material from these areas. What we want is material from the hills or the highlands of the moon, because the reflectivity from that area is much brighter than the mare or the seas. The material might be different. We know there's ejecta on top of the hills that come from the interior. We can learn a lot about the structure of the moon itself. And consequently, Apollo 13 was designated to go to a place called Frau Maro in the hills of the highlands near a large crater called Frau Maro. Of course, as you know, we took off on this flight, the third flight. Right away, we had a problem on the big Saturn V. The first one that we had, we lost the center engine on the second stage of our vehicle. About 2 minutes early, it shut down due to high vibrations in the structure that it was attached to. I looked at my companions and said that, almost every space flight has some sort of a glitch go wrong to it. Hopefully we can get through this one, and this is our crisis for this flight. It turned out we did get through it, and we were on our way to the moon. And then, of course, as you all probably know, there was a series of incidents that occurred 2 days out when we tried to stir up the oxygen to stir it up so it wouldn't be stratified and heat it up a little bit. We had an explosion, by the way, of an oxygen tank. That was the accident was set up 5 years before we took off due to a thermostat that was not the proper one, that all the space flights before that time flew with that thermostat. But we had other problems on the during the testing. We had a lot of series of crises to get over, and really the flight was a beautiful case in crisis management, a case where a group of people in a control center could look at one crisis at a time, not panic, get all the brains going, get teamwork involved, and try to figure out the solutions to things that we had to do to get back home safely. People often ask, in the spacecraft, did we panic? Well, we could have panicked and bounced off the walls for about 10 minutes, but we'd be right back where we started from, and so we decided to figure out how to get home. We used, of course, the lunar module to get home, a vehicle that was designed never to come back to the Earth, designed only to last about 45 hours, merely to be detached once you're in lunar orbit, to land and then explore, rendezvous again, and then toss away. Had to extend it for 90 hours because we had to go all the way around the moon. We, of course, had a crisis with our own exhalation, breathing out carbon dioxide. The lunar module had a system that removed the carbon dioxide using round canisters, but these canisters were becoming saturated. The command module had plenty of canisters to remove carbon dioxide, but the command module was dead, and those canisters were square. And you can't put a square canister into a round hole in the lunar module system. And consequently, back at the ground, using their ingenuity and their thoughtfulness, they used tape, plastic, and cardboard to jury rig a square canister to work in the lunar module system so that we could get the partial pressure of carbon dioxide back down again so that we wouldn't be poisoned by our own exhalation. Which, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, indicates that on a $20 billion program, without tape, plastic, and cardboard, you're lost. A lot of airplane designers have found out the same thing, I think. But these were the problems that we faced coming home. We had to, of course, monitor our electrical power very carefully, had to turn off everything in the command module to save the batteries, the little entry battery that we had. Had finally to turn off everything in the lunar module, even that nice guidance system and computer that we would not be caught out there without, even the autopilot to help us stabilize it. Only thing we had working for us was the radio to talk to the Earth and a little fan to circulate the atmosphere. We were literally flying by the seat of our pants, and then, of course, about 107 hours after we got back, or on our way back, the ground finally told us that we were no longer on the proper course to make a safe entry back into the atmosphere again. And that's when we had to sort of jury rig again and look at the Earth and figure out a method of using the lunar module engine to get back into the reentry corridor, to get back in for a safe landing. It was a group of people back at the control center working together, we're using that teamwork, and it was a great triumph, I think, of our space activities and a triumph to the technology of this country to finally get people together that, when facing a crisis, can work to get things back on shape and to get us home safely. And that's, in some respects, although the flight was a failure, it was, and years later, as we look back on it with hindsight, a triumph in another way.
Do you think, Jim, that it reflects some of what we were talking of just a little earlier, the lessons learned during Mercury and Gemini, the business of learning how to adapt almost anything, to do almost anything?
Roy, I think that is one of the outputs of our program that is so, amazing to me and so nice to look back on, how a group of people can look at a situation, starting from the very beginning, think about getting man into space. How do we get somebody into space and let them live? And then, okay, we've gone that far, and then how do we get them to the moon and land? And we look at the problems we've had and how we can move things around. It's one of the, I think, one of the aspects of this manned versus unmanned flight, of which there are reasons for doing both, but man has the capability of doing changes, making decisions at the spur of the moment. No one has yet developed a computer that can replace the brain for working real time. And I think that was one of the lessons that we learned on Apollo 13.
You know, it was my privilege to be pool correspondent. I was there looking over the shoulder in mission control of all of those people who are working so hard to bring you back. There were others behind the scene, like Gene Cernan, working over there in the simulators, a whole team of guys headed by people such as John Young, the other astronauts. They were all working. Shep, I think you were already getting ready for your mission at the time, weren't you? I'm trying to remember now who was there physically. But I'm remembering this tremendous feeling in mission control that we've got to bring this off. And we're not really sure that we can, but we're going to try. And I can see Deke Slayton, may he rest in peace, in the middle there, holding up filters and holding up ways to put that round thing into a square hole. These were the things that were going on behind you while you were up there suffering the trials and tribulations of an entry that was quite a movie. By the way, how did you like the movie?
The movie is quite accurate. The movie, most of the incidents in the movie are true. There is some artistic license taken in it. Number one, the movie depicts Jack Swikert as having not been in the simulator for a couple of months, that we all had, our concerns whether he could do the job or not. Actually, Swikert was a very, very competent pilot. He actually wrote the malfunction procedures for the command module. We had all the confidence in the world once he got on board, and once we trained with him for about 4 days. There wasn't any argument, by the way, if you've seen the movie, between Hayes and Swikert. Everybody was purely professional, but Ron Howard, the director, had to show some of the strains that was going on in the spacecraft at the time, and the only way he could do it was to have a verbal exchange between the two. But other than that, the movie was accurate, and as far as bringing back and learning about how to save electrical power, the movie sort of depicts Ken Mattingly as the one who came up with it. And if you talk to Ken, he'll readily admit that there were lots of people like Gene and Al and everybody working together to come up with a solution. So that was really a team effort, and he was merely a person to represent all these people in the latter part of that movie.
Yeah, Wally.
I was broadcasting with that other Walter in those days, and one of the touching remarks I think is worth sharing with you, Grumman did one hell of a job. One of our fellow test pilots, Leo Krupp, was over there representing CBS and Grumman, and the whole Grumman plant had turned out to solve the problem of the lunar module. But the one-liner, I told Jim, at least if he had the one-liner in the movie, would have given Grumman more credit. They did send a bill to North American Rockwell for $250,000 for towing.
Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, while all of that was going on, Alan Shepard was getting ready to fly next. And of course, Apollo 14 was just a piece of cake after 13, wasn't it, Alan? Well, maybe not. I note with more than passing interest that it was a long time between flights for Admiral Shepard. Was it worth waiting for?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about it, Roy. Obviously, I was disappointed that I was physically grounded for a few years, but fortunately was able to get that corrected and to have a second flight. Before we talk about that flight, let me go back to Freedom 7 again. You've heard a couple of things that happened around that flight, but let me just sort of give you, from my point of view, the way they happened. First of all, an interesting thing to me happened after Jack Kennedy had given me a medal, and we were scheduled to ride down Pennsylvania Avenue, my wife Louise, who is here today, and I with Lyndon Johnson. There's going to be a reception on the Hill. Well, we pulled out of the White House gate in a long stretched convertible limousine with the top down, and I could tell that the vice president who was sitting between us in the back seat was totally bored with the whole process. But we did drive out of the gate down Pennsylvania Avenue, and someone says there were somewhere between 250,000 and 300 people leaning out of office buildings and gathered along the sidewalk. And we go about 5 or 6 blocks, and Lyndon, looking around, he turns to me, he said, Commander, get up on the back and wave to these people. So I up in the back and I'm waving, and Lyndon, a few more blocks, said, Miss Shepard, get up on the back and wave to these people. So Louise is up there waving, and a few more blocks, there is Lyndon up in the back, and man, he is waving. All the way to the steps of the Capitol. As it turned out, the Capitol function was originally scheduled to be our last function of the day, but President Kennedy indicated as we were leaving that he wanted everyone to come back to the Oval Office after the reception. So we were all back there, all the Mercury astronauts and members of Congress, leaders of Congress, leaders of NASA. And there's a great picture, I believe Wally and I sitting together on the couch. Jack Kennedy's leaning forward in the rocking chair, and I'm telling him how aviators tell their stories. And as I indicated earlier, you may remember that one of the things which was most important to us was to indicate that a trained pilot, even on a nose cone on top of a rocket, can act like a trained pilot. He can make observations, he can fly, he can communicate reasonably well. And of course, we were pleased that fortunately in the short duration of my flight, I was able to do all of those things, manually control and observe and report. So we were quite tickled about the fact that we had done that, and I think Kennedy sensed that as well in the conversations afterwards. Obviously, there was a great sense of pride and national pride, having flown only just a few weeks after the Soviets. But during the course of this conversation, back at the Oval Office, Kennedy said to Jim Webb, who was then administrator of NASA, what are the plans for future flights? They talked about Gemini and so on. He said, no, I mean beyond that. I said, well, we did have some studies going on as to whether if one goes to the moon, whether it's better to rendezvous before you leave or rendezvous when you're there and this sort of thing. And that's when Jack said, I want a briefing. And he was briefed about 10 days after the meeting in the Oval Office, and it was just a short 3 weeks after a total of 16 minutes of spaceflight experience when Kennedy made his pronouncement, as you have heard earlier. Now, there was a tremendous reaction, a tremendous response from the people in the country. They were caught up with the challenge to them. There was here again was a confrontation in the Cold War with the Soviets. But then there were those people in the press who chose to indicate that it might not have been a national decision, that there may have been some political motives. And in the aftermath, some historians have still treated that as a political decision. Let me tell you from the inside out, number one, the sense of enthusiasm which Kennedy showed that day was genuine. You may recall in July of '61, Gus Grissom made a suborbital mission. You may recall in February the following year, John Glenn made his orbital mission. The three of us were invited to fly into West Palm and join Jack Kennedy to fly with him to Washington for the celebration of Glenn's flight. Oh, by the way, let me deviate just a moment. Turned out that little Caroline and Jackie Kennedy were not going to fly up with us, but they wanted to meet the three great American heroes. So we all go aboard the airplane, and little Caroline is there. She's a cute little thing down to about here, and she's introduced to all three of us in succession, and she curtsies up and curtsies to each one of us and looks up and says, "But where is the monkey?" Oh boy, the three great American heroes right through the heart. But we flew, the three of us sat with Jack in his private cabin, all the way to Washington. People came in with papers that, no, we'll get that when we get to Washington. Absolutely no interruptions at all. We talked about what Gus had done, what John had done, and what I had done. And the same sense of enthusiasm and the same sense of national pride were still there. So I submit for your consideration that it was certainly a decision based upon his sense of enthusiasm and excitement and one totally of national pride. A little bit about the relationship between Apollo 13 and 14. Obviously, as you've heard, it was a great deal of time between the missions, and not only fixing the problem with the cryogenics, which occurred, was the main problem with 13. There are also some other areas of possible failures that had been treated. So we were pretty well assured that we weren't going to have any problems at all. And as a matter of fact, we had a relatively uneventful mission. As you may know, the procedure is once you're on the way to the moon, you fly the command module off, turn around, rendezvous with the lunar module, stick it on your nose, and off you go. This docking process on Apollo 14 produced some anxious moments. As a matter of fact, the damn docking mechanism didn't work. Flew in, Stu Russa, the command module pilot, flew in, and absolutely perfect engagement, and just drifted back out again. Several times this happened. We backed off, talked to the ground, tried again. There was some serious moments. As a matter of fact, I was getting ready to put on the pressure suits to go up in the float up in the nose cone, open the door and grab this damn thing and pull it in myself so we could go to the moon. Fortunately, we didn't have to do that. Finally figured out that the little devices in the probe were not working properly, so just a tremendous amount of force and inertia would eventually lock it, which we did. So that was another ho-hum one down the drain. And secondly, now we get into orbit around the moon, and the lunar module we've separated from the command module, and Ed Mitchell and I are orbiting around, and we had a device, a procedure that before one goes to land on the moon, one disengages the computer from the autopilot and actually starts it down on a path so you can take a look at all the parameters that need to be met in order for you to have a successful descent. Well, our computer started down and came right back up into orbit again. We tried it a couple of times, and finally they said, you guys have your finger on the abort button? Now, the abort button is a big red button, but it has a cover over the top of it. We said, you got to be kidding. He said, no, absolutely, you're getting an abort signal. Well, something had floated around on the abort, within the switch, and actually shorted out the switch so that we had a definite abort all the time. Well, some bright guy at 3 o'clock in the morning up at MIT, they wake him up, and he figures out how to write around that. And so we reprogrammed the computer, tried again, and everything's going along fine. Now we're finally going down to land on the surface of the moon. As you heard earlier, there's some discussion about the landing radar. Now, the inertial platform is designed to get you down reasonably close to the surface, but if you have some mountains in the area of the landing, then the landing radar has to be operating in order for you to continue on down, because you're basically flying on your back during the early part of the descent. Well, the ground rule was the landing radar had to be operating by 13,000 feet. You were not permitted by the ground rules to proceed below that altitude. Well, it turned out our landing radar was not working. We're not getting indication. They called up from Houston and said, your landing radar is not working. We said, we know that, thank you very much. And they said, "You know the ground rule?" They said, "Yes, we know the ground rule. Thank you very much." Finally, some bright guy way back in the corner figured out that the landing radar, in fact, was working, but it was locked on infinity. So he said, "Pull the circuit breaker, reset it, and it probably should work." So it does. And it was a matter of just a few hundred feet. We were finally given the go-ahead to go down and land. We landed, by the way, I think about as close to the designated target as any of the 6 missions. And we're sitting there on the ground, my co-pilot Ed and I, and we're throwing switches on and off and so on. We're sitting there. Finally, Ed turned to me and said, "What were you going to do if that landing radar wasn't working at 13,000 feet?" I said, "Ed, you'll never know."
Okay, it's time for Apollo 17, the last flight to the moon, December 1972. 72, Gene. Commanded by Gene Cernan. And Gene, you know, I'll never forget, nor will most Americans, the sheer joy of hearing you sing while strolling on the moon one day, while you were actually strolling on the moon one day.
I've got to make a comment about Apollo 13 and 14 because I was intimately involved in both those flights in one way or another. First of all, I got back at Jim Lovell for flying Apollo 8 to the moon, which led to Apollo 10 not landing. The tanks that blew up on Apollo 13 were changed out and came out of the Apollo 10 spacecraft not long before launch. And Jim went ahead and flew them without checking them out ahead of time. Fate plays funny tricks, but that is true. Those tanks did come out for some reason. We were changing fuel cells out in Apollo 10, I believe. They pulled the tanks out, put new ones in Apollo 10, and Apollo 13 eventually flew with tanks, which were good at the time we gave them to him. You know, I'm not going to assume that Jim doesn't appreciate what went on Apollo 13 because he was there, and the rest of us were not. But Al's back up on Apollo 14, and we were the next kid on the block. We were going to fly next, and it fell to us to do a lot of that simulator work to try and find a way that these guys could fire that lunar module engine and get back. And I know Jim has no way of knowing what went on the ground. I know he appreciates it. But there were a lot of people spending a lot of time in simulators, not just working for a solution, but working against time. We had to find a solution or a method in some one way or another. And I was in a lunar module simulator with Joe Engel, my pilot backing up Al's crew. And you know, at that time things were a little cruder. MIT would rewrite the program for the digital autopilot to see if we could fly the lunar module with the big dead hunk of the command module on the front. And they'd send someone down on old National Airlines with a big roll of tape. They'd put it in the simulator. We'd roll it, we'd fly it, we'd crash 4 or 5 times, we'd give them a few selections. They'd rewrite the program and modify it up at MIT. It'd come back down. We'd try that again, we'd crash. And finally we found some one way or another, which you saw in a movie which Jim eventually used, where with 2 guys working together, controlling attitude and pitch, or the attitudes in pitch and roll, and him crudely but fortunately successfully sighting on, I guess, the limb of the Earth now, at that point, terminator of the Earth, was able to make that burn successfully. And you know, it was one of those, I think it was Crayons that said, you know, failure is not acceptable. We got involved in Apollo 13, just like we got involved in the entire Apollo program. When JFK said, we're going to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they're easy, but because they're hard, I'm not sure many people at that time believed in. I wasn't even in the space program. I mean, I look at it as him asking the American people to do something that most people thought couldn't be done, that most people thought was impossible. And yet, the more you got involved, the more you believed not only that it could be done, but that there was nothing going to stop you from doing it. A mini Apollo program was Apollo 13. I think people got involved so wrapped up in the fact that it was unacceptable not to bring these guys home, that we got to the point that we knew not only that we could do it, but we could do it the way it needed to be done. And Jim, in looking back retrospectively, quarter century later, I'm not sure if any of us, maybe even you, knew how close we came to losing 3 human beings in space. And the amount of teamwork, the amount of effort from people across the cities and highways and universities and aerospace industries of this country that just threw away their badges and got done in 48 hours, which it probably would have taken 6 months to do otherwise. I think Apollo 13 is a true testimonial to what people can do when they're required to get the job done. Apollo 14, as I said, I was a backup for Alan Shepard. And that was a unique experience for those of you who know Alan. Number one, when Alan is back on flight status and hadn't flown since his first flight way back when in Mercury, and he was now on flight status and someone was given command of a lunar mission and he was going to get a chance to walk on the moon, when you were the backup commander behind Alan Shepard, the one thing you knew is that you were the backup commander. There was not a chance in hell of you ever flying that mission. It didn't make any difference. Abort buttons, landing radars, or whatever. There was no way. I mean, I accepted that. I never let Al know it, but I accepted that. And a long string of incidences led me to getting that opportunity. But my other boss, Al was one of my other boss, Deke Slayton, gave me a chance that other people might have given me, and that was actually the chance to back up as commander. I wanted probably to have command of a flight more than I wanted to walk on the moon. Backing up Al was my test case, and I think Deke threw me into the fire, because up until that time, Alan was, that steely-eyed Alan Shepard guy that you're not sure what he's thinking or what he's going to say or what he's going to do, and all of a sudden I had to stand up and tell him I was just as good as he was. I mean, that was my job. Deke said, go in and tell him you're just as good as he is. I said, Deke, give me a break. But as it would have it, I think here we are again a quarter of a century later, earning each other's respect. Perhaps Apollo 14 is a brightest spot in my career in a space program as my other three flights that I did fly. And for those young men and young women out there, don't ever be afraid to respond to a challenge, because when Alan flew way back in May of 1961, 36 years ago, I was just a young lieutenant on the West Coast, just came back from my second cruise to Westpac, and I, like everybody else in the entire world, just looked up and, this was my hero. Who was this guy who jumped on top of a rocket and go into space? Some guy named Alan Shepard. And it was 10 years, give or take a couple weeks to the date, that Al and I stood side by side the night before he was to lift off to the moon on Apollo 14. As I said earlier, fate plays some funny tricks on people, but if you hang in there, you just might surprise yourself. Apollo 17 was unique for lots of reasons. It was the last flight. I had lots of yellow stripes out there in the sky that these guys had painted for me. There had been 5 previous lunar landings, and by the way, I want to get this one in. 4 of the 5 were commanded by naval aviators. The one that didn't land, Apollo 13, was commanded by a naval aviator, and the first Apollo flight was commanded by a naval aviator. I can go on and on and on, but that's something I think we have a right, we have a right to be proud of. And by God, the last one, although there were some people in management who literally gave me the direction, if it comes to landing and getting back alive, course, my intent was to do both. Get back alive. But I tell you, I was intent at that point in time to see not only the first man to have stepped on the moon, but the last man to have left his footprints on the moon, be a naval aviator, and we did it. We truly did it. Apollo 17 was unique because it was a night launch. It was the first night launch ever in a manned spacecraft space program. And let me tell you, having ridden on a Saturn V in daytime, riding on a Saturn V at night is everyone's a first. Every flight is a first. And when you go from a day Saturn V to a night Saturn V, it's a first. We launched at 12:33 a.m. on the, oddly enough, the 7th of December, 1972. Someone described the launch to me as if the universe lit up from without. And it's a wildlife preserve down at Kennedy, and we saw pictures as soon as the light hit before the sound crossed the water. Fish are jumping, and it just was an incredible sight for people on the ground. I was afraid we had a 3-hour delay. Being the last flight, I was afraid people had lost interest, and with a 3-hour delay at midnight, between 9 and 33 minutes after midnight, I figured everyone would go home, get tired and go home. And if we had postponed to another day, I knew 3/4 of those people wouldn't come back. But we ended up going. It was unique also because my crew included a geologist. There had never been a scientist to fly. That was good news and bad news from my point of view. I lost a super lunar module pilot in Joe Engel, who was a compatriot of Neil's flying the X-15, an Air Force pilot, and an extremely, extremely good one. I think he had not made a mistake. He'd been a naval aviator. I told him that many times. Joe didn't get to fly. The bad news. The good news is Jack Schmidt did get to fly, and the good news is Jack Schmidt, a geologist, was dedicated, was focused, was capable, and quite frankly did an outstanding job. And in retrospect, although it was difficult to accept that change at the time, in retrospect, it was the right thing to do. It was the last Apollo flight. We had a geologist in the program. He was qualified. He'd served on a backup crew. He'd earned his stripes. And it was the right thing to do to fly Jack. Now, after I came off the backup crew of Apollo 14, there were a lot of guys left that were ready to fly Apollo 17. So it was not just a roll over and play dead, you're going to get Apollo 17. Competition was always keen in the program. It worked out without going into a lot of details. I was, as I say, fortunate enough to get command of 17. Which included Ron Evans, another naval aviator, and Jack. Flight was 13 days, the longest flight. We landed in a sort of the northeast corner. Every thing about a Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, each flight depended upon the one that preceded it, and the one that followed depended upon it. Of course, no one depended upon us. I mean, we were the last, but we sure depended upon everyone and everything that was done before us. So Apollo 17, by the nature of the flight, should have been the most challenging. So we landed in a very mountainous area in the northeast corner of the moon. Rather than a focus around the equator, where the predictability of the trajectories were a little bit easier, the navigation was a little bit more predictable, we landed over in the northeast, sort of the northeast edge or corner of the moon. We landed in a valley, and the best way I can describe it, it had mountains surrounded it on 3 sides that were higher than the Grand Canyon is deep. Mountains that surrounded us on 3 sides, a valley that was about 20 miles long and about 5 miles across. Contrary to what has been said here before, Apollo 17 was the most accurate landing on the moon. We came closer than anyone ever had come before, and I will admit this, we didn't know where we were until after the second day on the moon. We knew we were in this valley somewhere. It was a spectacular experience. We took the lunar rover. Which was flown on 15, 16, and 17. An electric car. We drove it some 36 kilometers over those 3 days. I was the only car within 250,000 miles that knocked a fender off, and I haven't heard the last of that. We always tended to look both ways when we crossed our own tracks to make sure we were the only ones there. Unfortunately, notwithstanding what has been written by other people in other books, we were the only ones that were there at the time. We stayed 4 more days around the moon after we lifted off the surface. We brought back some 250 pounds of lunar rock, put up a small nuclear power plant that operated on the moon, operated experiments we left on the moon for some 10 years thereafter. I'm going over all this very quickly to tell you what a quantum leap we took from Neil's 6 hours on the surface. On the surface. See how you forget 22 hours on the surface to being on the surface over 3 days. The quantum leap that took place between 1969 and 1972, between the beginning of the program and the end of the program. We truly felt that we knew what we were doing, and we felt we knew how to do it. We came back. Ticonderoga was our target. I logged it as a carrier landing, legitimately in my books. After we came that close. I have 3 carrier landings that have got asterisks on them: Gemini 9, Apollo 10, and Apollo 17. People build us. Roy and his friends in the media billed us as the end, and I said it was not the end, it was just the end of the beginning. Predicted that not only would we return to the moon, but by the turn of the century we'd be on our way to Mars. Somewhat disappointing that we're not. I'm only half wrong. We will be on our way to Mars. It may just be another generation or so before we get there. I've held the distinction and perhaps dubious honor of being tagged as the last man to have left his footprints on the surface of the moon, and I consider that temporary. There's always only going to be ever one first human being to step foot on the surface of the moon, and you're looking at him. There's going to be lots of other human beings who become the last person to have walked on the moon. As I say, it's a distinction that I've held for far longer than I expected, a title that I've cherished, if you will, at some times, far longer than I ever expected. And Roy, before I quit, I just want to say something, pick up a little bit about something Jim said about the Earth. Because landing on the moon is a unique experience. But for me personally, landing on the moon was not nearly as overpowering and as memorable as just going to the moon and looking back at the Earth from 250,000 miles. Because in Earth orbit, we've all been there. You fly at 17,000 miles. You fly around the Earth in an hour and a half. You fly through a magnificently beautiful sunrise and sunset every 90 minutes. You fly over a river, a coastline, a peninsula, your hometown maybe if you're lucky. But when you head out to the moon and you accelerate to 25,000 miles an hour and you see that horizon that was slightly curved when you're in Earth orbit somehow close in and around and upon itself, portraying a picture in front of you that is familiar yet very, very strange, because you realize no longer are you flying over rivers and coastlines and continents, but now or rivers and peninsulas, but now you're beginning to look across oceans and continents, and no longer are you flying through that sunrise and sunset every 90 minutes, but now you're literally watching them set simultaneously on one continent, knowing it's rising on the other continent all at the same instant. And you truly, as Jim I think tried to say a minute ago, are detached, because that's where your life, your past, your future, your loved ones, your family, everything you can identify with is there on that Earth. And as you go out, that Earth gets small very, very, very quickly at first, and then more slowly as you approach the moon, until you can get to the point where Jim said, you can literally cover up existence as you understand it with something the size of your thumb. You find yourself captured by one planet, totally detached from the identity of reality as you knew it, as you know it at that point in time. And you take that other step and can feel and touch something hard, another planet in this universe, which you now call your home. The Camelot, as I call it, was a valley we lived in, and you realize that it almost seems sometimes like a dream, and the only identity with reality is that Earth that you see that's sitting on top of that mountain. I think it was Bill Anders or someone, but somebody said, you know, we went to explore the moon and in fact discovered the Earth, because when you look back at the Earth surrounded by a three-dimensional blackness which is beyond your conception, the infinity of space and the infinity of time, I can't go any further in describing it than telling you it exists, because we all of us here saw it with our own eyes. You watch the world move through that blackness with logic and with purpose and with beauty beyond conception. I came to, not a religious, but perhaps a spiritual, admittedly a spiritual sense, because it was just too beautiful to have happened by accident. I felt there must be somebody above us all, above all religions, who put the small part of the universe together that I was privileged to see at that moment in time. Walking and stepping on the moon was a unique, special experience for me. I'm the luckiest human being in the world to have the 3 flights I've had. But just having gone that far and looked back is the thing I think that probably sticks most memorable in my mind. And I just wanted to expand upon what Jim was, I think, getting to or alluding to. That's my feelings. I can't speak for anybody else. But I think we all came back. After Jim came back with that picture, that one picture, I think, changed the entire world in the manner in which we look at ourselves.
Got a few congressional committees I think we'd like to have you talk to in the next few weeks, Gene. Have you make exactly the same talk. Because with Gene's flight, yes, indeed, Apollo did end. Oh, there were some more. Apollo-Soyuz that you may remember, first flight with the Russians. Space Lab, in which long-duration missions were tested. And now, this is the time of the space station, which ain't going to take us where you just did, Gene. Is not going to take us out to the moon where you took us, Neil. Not going to let us share that experience that you saw before your eyes, Jim, Alan. Instead, with the space shuttles taking over, our newfound allies, the Russians, are broke, but they're still working. And the United States is going ahead with massive plans for the International Space Station. American astronauts are now spending 4 months at a time in the Mir Russian space station. Phase 1 of such station activity is well underway. As a matter of fact, STS-83, that's Shuttle Transportation System mission number 83. Gee, that's a lot of flights when you stop and think about it. It's poised at the Cape right now, ready to fly. You want a night launch, Gene? They're supposed to launch, they're scheduled to launch at 4:08 in the morning on the 15th. It should still be dark by that time, even here in Florida. They'll go into orbit, hook up with Mir. Astronaut Dr. Jerry Leninger will come back after 4 months of true trial and tribulation, living in a spacecraft that was designed for a life expectancy of 5 years and has now been in orbit for 12 years. I'm talking the Mir, of course. Mike Foale will be up there building toward the space station so that sometime after the turn of the century, slipped a bit, there will be a permanent presence in space. And we can only cross our fingers and hope that somehow that might in turn be a leaping off point for the kind of future that you envision. So now we begin to get around to turning this session over to you, our audience. And we're going to go into questions and answers, and I'm going to ask Earl Rogers, who helped set all this up, to help me locate the microphones so that I can tell you where they are. I see one of them coming down the center aisle right now, and I see a hand up from a youngster over here. I'm going to hold you up while you get to that microphone. There's the mic right there. Would you move over to the mic? And as we do, gentlemen, I'm going to claim the first question while we get things set up. I just mentioned the 83rd mission in Shuttle. You'd figure that spaceflight by now was routine. Neil, do you think it is?
I don't think it'll ever be routine. I can't imagine anyone seeing the sights and experiencing the emotions you get in flight that would make it routine to anyone. Flights seem terribly complex to many, and they are. But we found that they could be broken down into smaller and smaller pieces until you finally got to a size that an aviator could understand, and then it was doable.
Wally, did you agree with that?
I think the interesting thing is that we're not jaded. Neil and I were down there watching that very launch of STS-83. And in addition, it was interesting because we were talking this morning, Gene Cernan and I, about how this mission came back because they lost one of 3 fuel cells. How many did you lose on your flight, Gene, on Apollo 10?
Well, we probably look at things a little differently than we did then because of the challenge of time and JFK, but we lost a fuel cell somewhere either on the way to the moon or around the moon on Apollo 10. We had 3 of them. I guess no one had any guarantees they'd ever fly. No one had any guarantees they'd ever get back. No one had any guarantees they'd ever land. But it all seemed to be worth it to us.
Good. All right, I see at least one mic in place. Will somebody help me find the other? There should be 2 on the floor.
Roy, over to your right here.
Right up over here. Okay, let's start that in the center floor right over here. Would you, in each case, as you get around with your question, tell us who you are and point the question in the direction of one of our astronauts, please. Go right ahead.
My name is Tim Osterhout, and I would like to ask Mr. Armstrong, what was it like to walk on the moon?
You would really like it.
Thank you.
All right, let's jump back over here. Go right ahead.
Okay, I'm Glenn Marcantel, and my question is for Neil, kind of elaborating on the same thing. I'd like to know the human aspect of what you felt when you first stepped onto the moon surface, the human feeling of what it was like knowing you were the first human being and the only one there.
I'll take a crack and let others, Gene may have some other thoughts. The first sense of feeling what the moon is like is immediately after touchdown. Now you're in the lunar gravity. The forces you feel on your feet are those that you will feel all the time you're on the surface, and it's a particular enjoyable time. You feel very light. It's wonderful. The part of going down to the surface itself is very similar, except because you're encased in a very immobile suit, it's much more difficult. There was a great satisfaction, though, in getting to the surface. Not so much of the fact that that there was that much unusual about it compared to being inside the lunar module but landing, but the fact that we had accomplished what 1/3 people had worked a decade on here in America and elsewhere to accomplish to get to that point. And so we had the feeling that, hundreds of thousands of people were sharing the excitement of that moment.
I have news for you, Neil. Hundreds of thousands, millions of people were sharing that moment with you. The television wasn't the greatest, but nonetheless it was good enough, and the audio was superb. And we followed you through every step, you and Buzz, as you walked that day, with all of you.
I'll pick up Pete Conrad's comment on Apollo 12. It may have been one small step for Neil, but it was a hell of a big one for the rest of us.
Okay.
There is something different about getting out of that spacecraft and squeezing through a hole that's smaller than the size of your spacecraft, knowing that you got to squeeze back in. But getting out there on the ladder and realizing that the 1/6 gravity plays an effect, but that you're literally taking steps or jumps almost down to the surface of the moon. It's uniquely different when the sun shines on you. You come out of that hatch and you're on the way down to just simply having. Had we landed and not been able to go out, perhaps that would have been the greatest disappointment in the entire world. Geologist or no geologist, I would have found a way to fit in his spacesuit if mine had failed, I promise you.
Alan, how far did you really hit that golf ball?
Well, actually, realizing that the gravity on the moon, as you've heard, is several times is 1/6, that also realizing that there's no atmosphere up there, that a golf ball would go 6 times as far with the same club head speed, and it would not curve, it would not slice or hook because there's no atmosphere to make it turn. So that's what intrigued me about the whole process. And even to this day, when you tell an avid golfer that he could hit his driver 1,500 yards, his eyeballs get pretty big.
All right, question right over here.
My name is Eddie Buckley, and this is for Jim. What's it like coming back from space? Were you feeling sick from re-entry?
For whom was that question?
Jim.
For Jim? Okay.
You said, what's it like coming back from space in a rather difficult situation? Well, actually, when we finally fired up the command module, we had a small battery and we got everything back on track again. The command module worked perfectly for us on the way in. The difficulty was that no one on the ground knew what the situation was because we did not know whether the explosion had ruptured or cracked the heat shield, which if it had, we would have burned up on the way through into the atmosphere. And consequently, we actually came in shallow, which made our, what we call our blackout period longer, as if you saw that in the movie, and it was actually true, but not the length of the movie. And I also think that for dramatic sense, I think that Schweikert, who made the first comment to the control center, just held off a little bit for added suspense, I would suspect. But it was a very wonderful feeling for us because we saw the spacecraft working perfectly as it should have done on a normal mission when we finally got it back in situations to get it powered up, and of course we made a very successful landing.
Now let's go back over here.
My name is Ernest Paulson, and I'd like to direct this question to Admiral Shepard. Of course, I'm real happy to see that you haven't lost your sense of humor in the last 45 years. Do you feel that your work at Patuxent River, Maryland in TAC test did you a lot of good toward this program?
Your work at Patuxent River, did it do you any good on the space program? Your work at PAX, did it work at PAX? Did it work for you in the space program? Is that right, sir? Am I quoting you correctly?
Yes, flying as a test pilot.
Your time as a test pilot.
River,
well, the whole broad field.
Oh, I think so. I think certainly the one thing that all of us gained from being test pilots, dealing with unusual situations or figuring out a backup to a failure and so on, gives you a very analytical approach to things. And I think that's been very helpful to all of us in our careers in flying. I think it's still helpful in the space program today, even for those who are not actively involved in flying and controlling the shuttle, but those who are involved in experiments. There has to be a very solid analytical approach, not only to the educational process prior to the experiment, but also in creating ways to work around failures which may occur during the case of the experiment. So I think the analytical approach has been very helpful to all of us because it teaches you how to study, how to prepare, and then if something goes wrong, how to cope with that situation.
Now back to the center of the atrium.
Yeah, I'm Sean McCourt, and I've got a question for Jim Lovell. Were you scared when the explosion occurred?
Can you get a little closer to that mic?
Yeah.
We can't quite hear you up here.
Were you scared Were you scared when the explosion happened on the command module?
Was I scared at the time of the explosion? I was a little apprehensive. That was perhaps the low point of the flight because we knew that we were in trouble when we saw the oxygen escaping, and we did not really have the decisions or the procedures yet for how we could use the lunar module, whether it could even be used to get back home again. So yeah, I was a little scared.
This morning, by the way, we attended a viewing of IMAX. And would you believe that right in the middle they had a minor glitch, and suddenly the screen went blank. And Jim Lovell, in a fairly loud tone of voice, was heard to say, "Houston, we have a little problem here." True. Okay, let's cut back over here. Yes, sir.
Ensign Peak, this question is directed to Captain Cernan. Sir, you made a point of mentioning the role of naval aviators in early space flight. What role do you see naval aviators, and more importantly, naval flight officers, in future space flight?
I didn't quite get that question. Can I ask you to climb into the mic, give it to us again, and slowly?
What role do you see naval aviators and naval flight officers performing in future space flight as more and more astronauts are scientists and engineers?
To whom were you addressing the question?
Me.
To Gene?
Captain Cernan.
Did you hear it that time?
One of the things that I've lost, besides a number of other things, is
a lot of pilots have that same problem.
I think
you catch all that jet
heard,
noise.
He wanted to know what role
naval aviators and officers will play in the future.
Well, you know, I talked a minute ago about our role in the past. I think that's quite a tribute, a testimonial to the kind of training that we had and that you're getting. Quite a testimonial to naval aviation in general. I can't tell you why or how things came out the way they did, but there must be a reason somewhere. So let's say for openers you've got a good start. And I don't at this stage of the game and the way this program is progressing in the future, I think there's going to be room for all kinds of disciplines in space, whether it's in the space station or whether it's on a voyage back to the moon or on to Mars. There's going to be roles for pilots. There's going to be roles for scientific observers, for engineers, for scientists, for all kinds, probably even for poets and writers and artists and others, as well as doctors. Hopefully not lawyers, but boy, I'm probably in trouble on that one.
Okay.
So, you know, what I tried to say a minute ago when I gave you that little 10-year spiel about watching Al go, and 10 years later I turned around and was standing next to the guy that I was watching get fired off into space. Just get out there and do it your best. You know, if there's an opportunity, don't turn your back on it. Give it a shot. Don't be afraid. Probably the most important thing is don't be afraid to fail. A lot of people are afraid to try because they're afraid to fail. Everyone sitting up here has screwed up one time or another in their lives in aviation. Maybe Wally hadn't, but the rest of us have. In some one way or another, and somehow we screwed up doing what we thought was the right thing and ended up coming back to try again. And as I say, if we can stand here and tell you that we went to the moon before you were born, if I'm judging your age right, what are you going to tell me you can't do in your lifetime? Now that's a challenge for all you young men and women out there, young and old men and women.
Right over here.
My name is Kevin McNulty, and I'd actually like to hear what any or all of you have to say, but I'll direct the question to Captain Cernan. I sincerely share your hope that you're not the last man on the moon. And I'd like to know two things. One, what can we do as average citizens to see that you're not the last man on the moon? And what do you say to the people that argue, well, we have too many problems here to take care of first?
That's one really for the whole panel, but Gene, the question was directed to you.
It was directed to me, but I think any one of us can answer that. Maybe Wally can start.
I think so.
Did you get the question?
Well, I think simply the word commitment comes into mind. If you want to do something, you commit to it. And I think in this case, if we want to go back to the moon or possibly to Mars. It's going to take a long time to do that one. We had to have a commitment. And I think that's the essence of what then President Kennedy put on us. He committed us to doing a task that we were willing to accept. We need that kind of commitment again. Maybe a young, committed president is an oxymoron today, but I'm no longer on active duty. I can get away with that. This nation, and it comes out of my Navy heritage, I think those of us who saw part or all of World War II can recall the Seabees who said, "Can do." I think that's the essence of what this nation's able to do. If they want to do something and they have the leadership and the commitment, we can do almost anything we want.
Any of the rest of the panel want to tackle that? Okay, we'll move on then.
This museum, and Wally's right, this museum is a testimonial to what the American people can do if they're committed, if they want to do it bad enough, and are given the opportunity.
Out over here, please.
Hello, my name is Bobby Smith, and I have 2 questions for all of you. One is jumping on the moon more like jumping on a trampoline or just floating in the air? And 2, have you ever kept any moon rocks for yourselves?
Go ahead, Neil. You jumped on the moon.
It's a bit, the answer in the first part, it's about a cross between floating and being on a trampoline. If you weren't encumbered by a parachute suit unnecessarily, you wouldn't have to have stairways and buildings on the moon, because you could just jump up from one to the next floor. It's a delightful feeling, and it's really much better than here. The other
part 2, you talked about moon rocks. Would you repeat that part of your question?
Have any of you kept any moon rocks from the moon for yourselves?
Did any of you hear that?
No. We can't hear.
We're missing it. These people are laughing at whatever it is you're saying, and we can't quite hear you over the top. Climb into that microphone and say it nice and loud.
Okay. Now can you hear me? Now can you hear me? Okay.
Now we hear you.
Have you ever kept any moon rocks from the moon?
Go ahead, Jim.
I'll answer it, Neil. I have never landed on the moon. So I can officially say, to my knowledge, no one has any moon rocks of this group.
Anybody want to challenge that statement? Oh, dear. Okay, let's come over here. Go right ahead.
My name is Sean Carney, and this is directed towards Mr. Schirra. You have flown on all 3 programs, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. And my question is, how do you think that Mercury and Gemini set us up for the Apollo program, not just by knowing what we had harnessed here, the power, but also how it set us up for a fall with Apollo 1 and for landing on the moon, the excitement that it brought us as a nation?
I think I got that. You're talking about the progression of Mercury through Gemini to Apollo.
Yes, how did it set us up?
I used to tell a story about Alan Shepard, and in turn he told one about me. I put on weight since I first flew Mercury, and they had to make a larger spacecraft so I could fly that. That was Gemini. And then as I put on more weight, they made a larger one so I could fly Apollo. But each one was a stepping stone, and I think the control task became more complicated with time, and it was easier for me to accommodate because I had those earlier flights. I would say I probably lucked out in a way on the Gemini flight where the booster shut down. It looked like we had lifted off. All the electronic signals said we had lifted off. By having had a Mercury flight prior to that, I knew we had not lifted off, nor that we were going to settle back on the launch pad and blow up. And so we saved that mission. We hadn't talked about that earlier, but in the same light on Apollo, we're trying to develop a navigation technique where we could come back from the moon and re-enter precisely, in that if you came back from the moon and hit the upper atmosphere and bounced off, you were in a long trip, like a solar orbit. So you had to be able to re-enter the atmosphere and land at a precise landing point as well as re-entering. We were given an experiment during Apollo 7 where we were to look at a planet, it was Mercury, going through a Mercury set. As a sun set, this is Mercury coming through the horizon. It was a new thing for us. We were not trained for that, nor were we prepared for it. We did that under the urging of the flight controllers, and our computer locked up. It essentially went into tilt mode. Fortunately, and this is part of that 300,000 people team we talk about, while we were training at MIT, and Gene Cernan talked about that as well, we took this telescope sextant combination, and we were looking at stars and setting up the inertial platform. And Don Isley noticed that we could look across the Charles River at the nurses' quarters. This was at night, and he was hopefully looking for a nurse inside one of those windows doing something most appropriate for observing. The computer locked up. The technician told us, it's very simple, you hit something like clear and add, and the computer will start again. Well, our computer locked up on Apollo 7, and we said, that's the end of our controlled reentry. We've goofed it. As we went out of range from one tracking station between one and another, I just said, remember that nurse's quarters? Let's try it. Clear and add, and the darn thing started up again. At the next station, Houston called up and said, how did you get that thing started? You find out. It took them an hour, and they found that technician at MIT who taught us the trick. That's how all these things add up. And it's the human element of over 300,000 people. We keep saying that, but it was a very, very big team that came together in real time. That meant that we could almost talk to any one of 300,000 people if we needed to, any one of them. That's the teamwork we're all talking about.
I wonder, under some circumstances, if today Mission Control is as well equipped to handle the kind of crises that you fellows faced. Do you think they can really handle the crises during the shuttle program, during the Mir program? Are they that well equipped from what you know of them?
Well, as far as I know, everybody learns on other people's experiences. And the more and more that we get in complicated systems, the more developed we get. I think that in essence that the mission control today is just as well equipped and with just the same amount of talent if we have a shuttle or an orbiter problem that they had back there in Apollo 13, and they're perhaps more trained to handle crisis instead of seeing them suddenly come up.
Fact remains, too, they've been flying safely for quite a while. And I'd better cross my fingers and wrap wood after that statement. All right, let's come over here. Your question, sir.
My name is Richard Fillmore, and this is directed to Mr. Cernan. Do you think that the knowledge that we gained through the Apollo program matched our expectations to what we expected to learn before the program began?
Is that for me? Go ahead. Do I think the knowledge we gained, you know, the answer simply is yes, but that probably needs more explanation. You know, the technology to go to the moon didn't exist 19 or 16 days after Allen flew and JFK said we're going to do it. We had to develop computers and software and fuel cells and high-strength, low-weight materials and God knows what else. And ways to live in space, ways to work in space, ways to survive in space. We had to, you know, we're talking about developing electric cars here on Earth. We developed an electric car that drove around the moon flawlessly on 3 separate missions for days. So, you know, we weren't sure what we were going to learn, quite frankly, from meeting Kennedy's challenge. Science never is sure. We carried a lot of science on our missions. We took a lot of experiments. We came home with a lot of rocks trying to see if we couldn't learn something about the evolution of the moon, and in turn, perhaps something about the evolution of the Earth, maybe a little peek, a small little window into the past, or maybe even into the future. We're going to learn more of that kind of thing by going to Mars. But, you know, quite simply, yes, we learn. I don't know that there was a timetable of what we're going to learn, and there never is when you're delving out into the unknown, when you're in the exploration mode of anything. When you go around the corner, you can only think you know what's over there, and you can only prepare to the extent that you're going to encounter what you plan might be there. In almost every instance on every flight we encountered something we hadn't planned for, whether it was Jim's emergency, whether it was the way Neil had to tolerate. You know, there are some people who thought Neil was, when he landed on the moon, was going to go right through and come out the other end. I'm serious. There were people who truly believed that. Of course, there's people who still don't believe we went to the moon. But yes, you know, that's the real challenge of commitment. You never really know what you're going to learn. And the greatest unknown, we have an insatiable desire, you and I, everybody in this room, everybody on this world, it's human nature to learn something about the unknown. From my point of view, there's no greater unknown than the universe in which we live.
Now I have one last question for the panel. Do any of you feel that you have something you're just dying to say that you haven't had a chance to say this afternoon? No? I think then the time has come for us to say farewell. I would like to add a couple comments in closing, too. A couple of our astronauts have planes to catch, and so much as they'd like to stand around and chat with all of you and sign autographs, I'm afraid they have to make a fairly fast exit right out this way. But I do think that all of us owe them a deep debt of gratitude. Astronauts Alan Shepard, Alan Shepard, Wally Schirra, Neil Armstrong, Jim Lovell,